As folks are trickling in here, and I see we are trickling in, I'm just giving everyone a little time to join us. I'll introduce Doctors Haw and Markowitz shortly. Okay, looks like we are pretty close to having all of our registered attendees in the room. So welcome everyone to our first OAR book talk for the spring 2021 semester. Today's talk is featuring John Jay's own Professor Richard Haw, who is a professor of history and a member of the Interdisciplinary Studies faculty at John Jay. Richard is a native of Leeds in the UK and completed his PhD in his hometown at the University of Leeds before permanently settling in New York in 2001. He's written on a variety of subjects: literature, history, engineering, architecture, painting, photography, and his essays have appeared in Dreams of Paradise, Visions of Apocalypse, New York History, the Journal of American Studies, Seaport, and others. He's the author of The Brooklyn Bridge, A Cultural History, The Art of the Brooklyn Bridge, A Visual History, and the current book that is the subject of our talk today, Engineering America, The Life and Times of John A. Roebling, who was one of the 19th century's most brilliant engineers, ingenious inventors, successful manufacturers, and fascinating personalities. Roebling immigrated to the US from Germany in 1831, where he became wealthy and acclaimed, eventually receiving a carte blanche contract to build one of the 19th century's most stupendous and daring works of engineering, a gigantic suspension bridge to span the East River between New York and Brooklyn, which is, of course, now known as the Brooklyn Bridge. Dr. Haw's book illuminates not only Roebling's work, but also the world of 19th century America, along with the man himself. And Dr. Haw is joined today, and we are joined today by Dr. Gerald Markowitz, our own again, who is a distinguished professor of history at John Jay, where he's been teaching since 1970. He's the recipient of numerous grants from private and federal agencies, including the Milbank Memorial Fund, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Science Foundation. He was awarded the Wieseltier Prize for Outstanding Work in the History of Public Health from the American Public Health Association in 2000. Together with David Rosner, he's authored and edited numerous books and articles on occupational safety and health, including Lead Wars, The Politics and Science, and the Politics of Science and the Fate of America's Children, Are We Ready? The Public Health Response to 9/11, and Deadly Dust, Silicosis and the Politics of Occupational Disease in 20th Century America. He's also both the official and, I'd say, unofficial historian of John Jay College itself, having authored Educating for Justice, A History of John Jay College, originally published in 2004 on its third edition in 2008. We're about due for an update there, aren't we, Jerry? Jerry says no, but we'll see if we can work on that. And I will hand it over then to Richard. You're starting us off.
Jerry, are you starting, or?
I'm sorry.
No, I think you are.
Okay. Okay.
Directly to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dan, for that. And thank you to Rachel and everyone at the Office for the Advancement of Research for inviting me and putting this together. I'm a little sad that I can't be there. This would have actually been my first John Jay Wide talk, and it would have been nice to give it in the college. But I'm happy to be here anyway. And I'm here to talk about John Roebling, because I just published the first biography of him written in 76 years. I'm going to share my screen and do hopefully show lots of nice images for everyone to look at while I talk about John Roebling. Hopefully everyone can see that. And I realize that I'm talking about John Roebling in front of an audience who may not necessarily have a great sense of who he was. So maybe I should start there with a little rundown. John Roebling was a 19th century engineer, primarily of suspension bridges, and a manufacturer of wire rope, primarily. He was quite a big deal His death in 1869 was front-page news all over the US and further afield. Frank Leslie's magazine called him, quote, the most talented and scientific engineer of the age. An age, one might add, in large measure defined by engineering. Several years later, believe it or not, F. Scott Fitzgerald worked on a new movie version of his life. Henry Fonda was signed up to star in it, although ultimately the movie was never made. Nowadays, of course, Roebling is best remembered as the designer of the Brooklyn Bridge, and it is in that capacity I first got to know him. I've spent a lot of the last 20 years thinking about the Brooklyn Bridge, and doing so, I thought I'd gotten to know John Roebling quite well. But I also thought there was something a little suspicious about history's sense of him. Not only had no one done any fresh research on him in years, but our understanding of him was also very two-dimensional. According to all the history books, he was a flawless engineer and a rather flawed person. Rarely, of course, are people as two-dimensional as history might suggest. People, or history, has handed down to us Roebling, a vision of Roebling as a genius and a visionary, but also as steely and aloof, demanding, impatient, and humorless, not perhaps helped out by images such as this. He also has a reputation as a bit of a fool. He died of tetanus while working on the Brooklyn Bridge, in part because he refused all medical treatment and insisted on treating the wound only with running water until he died in agony. This was and still is known as the water cure, which I'll talk about later. He also has a reputation as a bit of a weirdo, a man who attended seances, read and believed all sorts of spiritual mystics, and believed in a whole host of now discredited medical practices. And this is what really I thought was fascinating, really stood out to me, this contradiction. Roebling could wrestle thousands of tons of wood, granite, and iron into beautiful and intricate monuments to humanity's capacity for energy and vision, combining advanced mathematics with the eye of an artist. Yet he also believed in spirits. He wrapped himself up in a wet sheet before going to bed, attended seances, assiduously avoided eating almost all fruits and vegetables, which he seemed to think were effectively poisonous, believed that the judicious application of water to the skin could remedy almost any ailment. How could someone, I thought or wondered, be so right and also so wrong? Such a genius and so bonkers. And all within what we might generally call the arena of science. And if he was such a contradiction in this area of his life, in the area that he had real mastery over, what about all the other areas of his life? So I set out, many, many years ago now it seems, to try and make sense of it all, if I could. So what did I find? Who was John Roebling? Well, let's move to a slightly better picture of him. None of the pictures of John Roebling are actually terribly comforting. This is a slightly better one. It's the only painting ever done of him, done late in life. All the images we have of him were very late in life. So the main thing I found out, which is great news for anyone writing a biography, is that many of the things people think they know about John Roebling are wrong, even the good stuff. He was certainly a great engineer, but he was not without his blind spots. And the things he's most famous for, his Why I Wrote the Business and the Brooklyn Bridge, were raised to their final dizzying heights by his sons, not by him. The bad stuff is also a little too simplistic. It often fails to account for the contexts of the times Roebling lived in, and it also relies too heavily on one or two sources of sometimes unreliable information. John Washington's eldest son, John Roebling's eldest son, Washington, the man who completed the Brooklyn Bridge after John Roebling died, wrote a really, really unflattering portrait of his father late in life, which has subsequently become sort of the standard interpretation of John Roebling. The memoir is interesting as a sort of reflection on the father and son relationship, but it's mainly inaccurate. If you compare it to letters written at the time, even letters written by Washington, much of the information in there is really inaccurate, and much of the things he has to say are inaccurate. But it's become sort of the dominant narrative about Roebling himself. Perhaps a tale there for why you should never believe sons about their fathers. So in what follows, I'm going to try and give you all an overview of Roebling's life, his beliefs and achievements. I'm going to sort of try and break this down to three sections, a rundown of his life and career, and then very briefly at the end, talk about him as an engineer, and then as a human being, specifically a human being of the 19th century. The broad outlines of Roebling's life can be traced relatively quickly. He was born and raised in the German town of Mulhausen during the Napoleonic Wars. This is a panorama of Mulhausen. This was actually done by John himself in 1825 when he was 19 years old. And he was born in 1806, and about 3 months later, Napoleon overran his whole area of northern German-speaking Europe. So John Roebling really sort of lived his first about 7 years of his life, 8 years of his life in a town that was basically an occupied territory. When he was 18, Roebling left Mulhausen to attend the Prussian Building Academy in Berlin, where he became interested in suspension bridges. This is an image from one of his student notebooks from 1826, and this is actually the Hammersmith suspension bridge over the Thames in London, which he studied. It's worth noting at this point that modern suspension bridges are really a very recent phenomenon at this point. The first modern suspension bridge is built in 1800, and by the 1826, by the 1820s, they've taken hold some places, but they're really not terribly reliable. A lot of them fall down. They're thought to be a good idea, but their mechanics and their science is yet to be really fully perfected. So they're very much a fledgling science, a very fledgling architectural shape, for want of a better phrase, in 1825. Also in Berlin, in one of those happy incidents of history, John also took a course of lectures with the great philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, helping spur a lifelong interest in philosophy and philosophical matters. A year after college, he headed off to Arnsberg in Westphalia to work as a civil engineer building roads. He stayed for 3 years, gaining an excellent education in all aspects of practical engineering. He built roads, houses, bridges, earthworks, culverts, drainage systems, did all sorts of things out there. He even designed 2 different suspension bridge designs. And there's something very interesting about this. So there was a couple of rivers in Westphalia that needed bridging, and there was 2 competitions. And he entered both of them with fully realized plans for a suspension bridge. These plans have actually been looked at by modern engineers, and they've been given a real clean bill of health. Most people think they would have been achievable, they would stay up, they would function, and they're really quite sophisticated designs for the time period in which they were drawn up. The remarkable thing about this is at this point, when John Roebling drew up these first 2 plans for suspension bridges, he'd never actually seen a suspension bridge in person. That came a little bit later. And it's also before photography. So what he'd studied was the technical literature, and what he'd seen was images, drawings of suspension bridges, but he was already able to design 2 very good, apparently, designs for them. This is actually the first suspension bridge John Roebling ever saw in 1829 in Bamberg. And Roebling actually never returned to Berlin, believe it or not. He never completed his engineering degree. He was one of the 19th century's greatest engineers, but he had literally 1 year of college under his belt. He returned to Mulhausen in 1828 and soon met a man called John Etzler, with whom he started to talk about emigration, specifically to America. Etzler is actually kind of an interesting figure in himself. He's still talked about. People write books about him and articles about him. He became quite famous by publishing this book, The Paradise Within the Reach of All Men, in 1833. The book was reviewed by Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden, and it's famous to us now. It's the first book to advocate for solar, wave, and wind power. Etzler believed that if we could harness the energy of the tides, the wind, and the sun, then the paradise would be within reach of all men. His idea was to create a world where there was no labor. We didn't need to labor at anything because we could take our energy from other sources. This book has gained Etzler the reputation as the first green technologist. So it's still a book that's important and talked about. Together, these 2 Johns, Etzler and Roebling, founded the Mulhausen Emigration Society in 1830 and set off for the US in 1831 in hopes of establishing a communal farming settlement. But the 2 fell out en route and they went their separate ways upon arriving in Philadelphia. Roebling's immigration, I think, helps us understand him and others like him, other immigrants, in a number of ways. Immigrants, of course, bring different perspectives and different sets of social norms and ideas when they come to new countries. I was born and raised in Britain with a completely free national health service. And on some level, I still think this day that the US not having a national health service is crazy. In Roebling's case, he didn't come from a country really at all. There's no such thing as Germany, the country, until 1871. There's just a collection of independent municipalities, cities, states, and regions. This is important, I think, in a number of important ways. I won't go into all of them now. The most important of which, as regards the US, was that Roebling had no sense of colonialism and no sense, really, or experience of slavery. It wasn't part of any sort of national narrative, as it was in other places. Germany had no colonies because there was no Germany. There was no centralized formal state. German colonies did happen. It came much later. There were dukes and the like, but their authority was local and narrow. There was no King Philip, no Queen Victoria, able to marshal all the engines of an organized, well-funded infrastructure and send them off on an errand of conquest. There were certainly trading companies in German-speaking Europe that trafficked in enslaved people, but these were more or less conducted as private businesses away from the national narrative. What Roebling did have instead was the childhood experience of Napoleon marching across Europe, confiscating food and resources and conscripting unwilling participants into his grand army. So he actually had really effectively the opposite experience growing up. What this led to when Roebling arrived in the US was a profound revulsion with the practice of enslavement. And this is, there's a number of quotes. He wrote quite extensively about slavery when he first arrived in the US. It is neither lying nor dissembling to say that slavery is the greatest cancerous affliction from which the United States are suffering. Slavery contrasts too greatly with the rest of their political and civic institutions. The Republic is branded by it, and the entire folk, with its idealistic and altogether purely reasonable constitution, perhaps not too reasonable, I think, if you think about the 3/5 slave cause, stands branded by it before the eyes of the entire civilized world. Roebling was horrified by the experience of slavery when he arrived in the US. He never reconciled to slavery in his life and was a lifelong and vociferous critic of the South. Still, he did adapt to his new country pretty well. He made his way out to Western Pennsylvania, which was an area with a lot of German settlers. He bought land in Butler County and slowly founded the village of Saxonburg, which is still there. It's a thriving little village. It's not terribly big, but it's still there. And it still has actually a number of these original buildings there as well. This is really our first image of Saxonburg from the 1830s. You notice it was printed by another Roebling in Mulhausen. This image was drawn up, sent back to Germany. E.W. Roebling was a printer who was a cousin, I think, of John Roebling in Mulhausen. He had it printed up and distributed as a sort of promotional device, trying to lure Germans over to the US. Roebling had founded a village. He needed people to settle in it, people to buy the plots of land that he was slowly dividing up. Unfortunately, though, even though John adapted to his new country very well, he did not adapt to his new lifestyle very well. He came to the US dreaming of being a farmer, and he was a terrible farmer. Couldn't farm anything or raise anything to save his life. He sort of plotted out this village and set it up for about 6 or 7 years, and then he slowly returned to engineering, working on the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal, which is the Pennsylvania version of the Erie Canal, and he started to conduct railroad surveys for the state of Pennsylvania as well, slowly returning back to engineering, getting paid for it, helping put food on the family table. His big real idea outside of suspension bridges occurred in 1841 when he hit on the idea of making rope out of spiraled wire, a notion that made his fortune and helped change the landscape of his adopted country. This is an image of what became of all that eventually the great Roebling wire works in Trenton. Traditional, up until this point, people using ropes had used traditional hemp ropes made from woven vegetable fibers, which were costly, inefficient, and they rarely lasted much more than a single year. Rope made from a spiraled wire lasted much longer and was adaptable to many different uses: rigging, cranes, derricks, eventually cable car systems and elevators. all of which exploded into the American landscape in the mid to late 19th century, and all were supplied by John A. Roebling's and Sons Company, who were the largest single manufacturer of wire rope in the USA well into the 20th century. I remember when I was writing this book, and I got towards the chapter that dealt with the wire rope industry, and I really was not looking forward to it. But then I started to sort of see wire rope everywhere and think about what a really incredibly important thing it is in our life. If you live in New York, we live in New York. What physically defines New York more than anything else? Skyscrapers, really. What's the most important thing about skyscrapers? Elevators. You can't have skyscrapers without elevators. What's the most important thing about an elevator? Wire rope. You can't have an elevator without wire rope. This is another image from Roebling's notebooks. This is actually a wire spinning device he devised when he moved to Trenton. And just as a summary, Roebling wire ropes pulled elevators up and down new tall buildings, making possible 1,000-foot high skyscrapers in New York and Chicago, held up suspension bridges of prodigious length from the Hudson River to the Golden Gate, drove mass transit cable car systems in thousands of towns all over the US. Wire rope was really a major big deal in the beginning of the 20th century into the middle of the 20th century, and still is. And all of this flowed from the industry Roebling set up in his backyard in the 1840s. In that image you see of Saxonburg, he built his first wire ropes in his yard outside there. Roebling's wire rope business liberated him to become something more than just a working engineer, something more like a gentleman engineer. Engineering wasn't what put food on the family table. That was the wire rope business. If it had been, Roebling's career would have looked very, very different. His manufacturing interests really allowed him to pick and choose what work he did. With his income secured, Roebling devoted much of the rest of his professional life to building suspension bridges. In nearby Pittsburgh, he built the Anagadi Aqueduct in 1844 and the Monongahela Suspension Bridge seen here in 1845 to 1846. This is from Pittsburgh over to the South Shore. Between 1848 and 1852, he built 4 suspension aqueducts in upstate New York for the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company. And here you see one of those aqueducts. Aqueducts, of course, take one body of water over another body of water. So this is actually a canal that you see sweep by there, and you see all these canal boats on here. And they would take that, these canal boats were used to transport coal from the Pennsylvania coal fields up towards the Hudson River and then floated down to market in New York. This is the largest of the suspension aqueducts that Roebling built, and it crosses the Delaware River at Lackawaxen. And actually, this has been retrofitted and is now used for cars, and it's the oldest suspension bridge in the United States. All this wooden trunk work and flume work was rebuilt by the National Park Service in the 1980s. These are the original wire rope cables, and much of the other hardware is original. Roebling's great triumphs in suspension bridge was the Niagara Falls International Suspension Bridge, the first fully functional railroad suspension bridge in the world, completed in 1855, actually really the only fully functional railroad suspension bridge ever built. You can see it here. It's got a train runs across the top and coach and horses and pedestrian traffic along the bottom. This runs from the Niagara Peninsula into what is now Canada, but what was then Britain, which we'll talk about in a second. This bridge, this is a photograph of the same bridge. You can see the size of it there. The bridge actually is very interesting as an artifact in the history of the Underground Railroad. It was all well and good getting enslaved people from the south to the north, but they still had to deal with the Fugitive Slave Act, especially in the 1850s, which allowed for extradition of enslaved people back to the south. If you really wanted to get safe, you had to get out of the United States altogether. And to do that, you had to get to Britain, what we now know as Canada. Or not now know as Canada, but what is now Canada. And loads and loads of formerly enslaved people were transported over the Niagara Suspension Bridge into Britain. There was a popular song from the 1850s, and now embarked for yonder shore, there a man's a man by law, the iron horse, the train, or will bear me over to shake de lions paw, England's paw. In the late 1850s, this bridge was completed in 1855. From 1855 to the outbreak of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass, who was living in Rochester at the time, sent dozens of formerly enslaved people to, quote, the suspension bridge. It's in his letters. And he often sent them to be escorted across the suspension bridge by Harriet Tubman, who ran sort of the Underground Railroad in and around the Niagara Peninsula in the late 1850s. Harriet Tubman was interviewed for several oral histories towards the end of her life, and she recounted various tales, some of which are in my book, of taking formerly enslaved people over Roebling Suspension Bridge and into Britain. Roebling's next great project was the Carvington and Cincinnati Suspension Bridge over the Ohio River between Kentucky and Ohio. At the time it was opened, in 1867, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. And it was also the first structure to link the North with the South after the Civil War. And again, sort of slavery played an important part in the history of this bridge. The initial idea was proposed in the 1840s, but was hugely controversial. As almost any reader of Uncle Tom's Cabin knows, the journey from slavery to freedom often took place over the Ohio River. Enslaved people called the Ohio River, or referred to it as the River Jordan, which explains why there were no bridges over the waterway. Until Roebling proposed one in 1846. This is his original proposal. This is what it was, a suspension bridge with a central tower. We tend to think of suspension bridges now as having a tower on either shore, instead of a central tower with a suspension structure going like that. And when Roebling proposed the suspension bridge in 1846, it was very welcome news in Ohio for commercial reasons, but much less so in Kentucky, who amended the legislation. For interstate legislation has to be signed off by both states. They amended the legislation to make anyone who built and operated a bridge over the Ohio financially responsible for any slaves escaping over it, effectively saddling any enterprise who would build a bridge with the cost of escaped slaves, which effectively killed the bill in Ohio. Eventually, after the Fugitive Slave Law, further legislation was passed, and it was started before the Civil War and finished after the Civil War. In between the Niagara and Covington and Cincinnati Bridge, Roebling built the St. Clair Street Bridge in Pittsburgh, and he was at work on what would have been his masterpiece, the Brooklyn Bridge, when he was felled by a tragic accident. This is actually the first ever image worked up of the Brooklyn Bridge. It was drawn by John Roebling and William Hildenbrand, an assistant, and it's the official image that accompanied his proposal. When he wanted to build a bridge, he wrote up a huge 100-page proposal with all the mathematics and everything in it, and he accompanied with this as a sort of vision of what the final bridge would look like. So this is the first vision. First vision of what the bridge would look like, and it's also remarkably similar, as we can tell, to the bridge that stands there now. I want to move on now to talk a bit about that was John Roebling's life. He was, and I want to talk about him a little bit as an engineer now. Roebling is best known as a suspension bridge engineer. It's his bridges that have made him famous, and rightly so. His place in the development of a suspension bridge as a preeminent structural form is central, and his impact is really easy to state. Before Roebling, most of them fell down, or at least suffered significant structural damage because of winds, other structural faults. And after Roebling, most of them stay up. And he's really the key figure in the development of the suspension bridge as a stable structural form. A question that rarely gets asked, though, of Roebling and other engineers is what he thought he was doing. Nowadays, in our times of extreme specialization, we think about civil engineers as closed off from broader social questions, selling their skills in metallurgy and mechanics to whoever has the requisite financing. This is just another image of Roebling. He's in the tan coat at the bottom there. This is with a group of other engineers inspecting bridges up in Niagara. This wasn't always the case. 19th century engineers often saw themselves as addressing what you might call the problems of civilization, rather than simply the problems of physics. And they wrote not just about specific problems they faced in their work, but about the impact they hoped it would have on the world. They had vigorous debates about education, about municipal politics, urban problems, and other issues. We are quite used to thinking of artists, writers, politicians, etc. as intellectuals, but not so with engineers, the very people who planned and created the built environment in which all that thinking got done, and about which much of that thinking revolved. Such a man was John Roebling. Roebling wasn't just an engineer, he thought about how engineering might affect the world. He was a deep reader of philosophy and an engaged social critic. He was a man who saw connections between things, between technology and society, between building things and building a better world. He believed that the endlessly repeatable forms of modern technology could bring about a more perfect union. And I'll just summarize by using a couple of examples from my book. I also want to say that Roebling wrote constantly. He wrote throughout his life in all sorts of ways. His private papers are just boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff. And not just technical works and notebooks, but literally thousands and thousands of pages of thoughts and ideas about society, about the state of the world, about philosophy. It's really hard to underestimate how important this material is in understanding him. And because it's so long and copious and difficult to read, I think I'm the only person who's actually read it all. Some of it's completely mumbo jumbo, some of it's really, really interesting. And just to give you a sense of the scale, for anyone who might be thinking about writing a biography and doing primary research, this is the first page of The Truth of Nature, which was literally one of dozens and dozens of pages, literally dozens of treatises that John wrote throughout his life. And this is just the first page, and it's one of dozens and dozens of them. This manuscript is 1,502 pages long, and I read it all, much to my... I have PTSD just thinking about it. Roebling believed that engineers could harness the resources of the natural world to create a more equal society. As he wrote in 1862 during the Civil War, he wrote a lot about society during the Civil War. He was sort of forced into, there was no projects being built, and he wrote a lot about the Civil War and a lot about US society. As comforts increase and become more plentiful, more within the reach of every human being, in the same ratio, social distinctions will be leveled down and common fellow feeling will be cultivated. It is the great mission of science to abolish slavery and to establish perfect freedom in its stead, which consists of perfect emancipation from natural as well as, spiritual bonds. The church refuses to assist, therefore science is left alone. And later in the same essay, with the vast powers of physical nature under our control, the day will come when, in consequence of a general diffusion of all essential comforts and even luxuries, now almighty dollar will have lost its charm and will have lost its controlling power. Oh, I wish. And then not until then will man be prepared to inaugurate another era in the history of his race. Roebling styled this the era of redemption, in which technology would lead to a profound moral adjustment. Human selfishness and exclusiveness will abate, and the true freedom of the mind shall be achieved. Man's sympathies will be enlarged, the human family will become one fast brotherhood, and the weak as well as the strong will be embraced. To use more specific examples, Roebling was a vocal proponent of both the Transcontinental Railroad and the Atlantic Cable as works of profound social connection and unity. And while John wrote lots and lots in his private life, and he was a very busy and engaged engineer, he also did function occasionally as an intellectual, writing articles about the need for a national university system, and here giving a talk about the Transcontinental Railroad before the Pittsburgh Board of Trade. Telegraphs and railroads, Roebling wrote, may be hailed as the latest offspring of the spirit of the present age. They have imparted a new and most powerful impulse to the social movement, from which yet flow a vast train of beneficial results. And if anyone was wondering how this would happen exactly, Roebling was happy to clarify. One of the best proofs of the advancement of mankind in true civilization is that the industrial efforts of nations are no longer squandered upon the creation of vast amounts of pride and of war. Like a magic wand, they instead open the slumbering resources and long-hidden treasures of the earth, draw into bonds of union and amity, isolate into individuals, as well as communities and nations, unchain long-cherished prejudices and selfishness, and cause to be made more simultaneous exertions in all that is useful and good. Railroads and telegraphs were the nurse of modern civilization, Roebling thought. They would band people together, heal divisions, make neighbors out of rivals, and free people out of the enslaved. Engineers saw railroads and telegraphs, along with suspension bridges and other great works of connection, as great works of technology and of moral advance, as physical things embodying functional design and philosophical principles, much in fact like Walt Whitman did. Roebling and others of his ilk were engineers through and through, but we might also describe them as practical philosophers. They saw a future made of iron and steel, molded by engineers into a world of unity and equality. This, as much as anything else, is actually why I called the book Engineering America. So the final section I'm just going to talk about here very briefly is John Roebling as a person, and specifically a person from the 19th century. As I mentioned earlier, I thought Roebling was a genius when I started this project, and I thought he was also a bit of a weirdo. Roebling wrapped himself up in a wet sheet before going to bed. This is part of the water cure. The water cure was a big deal in the 19th century. People were douched and dipped and showered, and water was applied in all sorts of strange ways, in very comprehensive ways. And as you see here, people were wrapped up in wet sheets, and it was thought to draw bad humors, illness out of the body. He also believed in spirits and attended seances, ate charcoal on a daily basis, treated himself with cold running water when he had tetanus, thought he could ward off cholera by pacing up and down and repeating, "I have it not, I have it not." He believed in odic force, which I won't bore you with, but you should Google it. It's completely crazy. And the space, he also believed that space was a substance, what he called ether. Also that the afterlife consisted of 7 spheres of existence that you slowly work through to get to the final stage, Summerland, which admittedly sounds really pretty nice. I think I'd like to live in Summerland, although perhaps not if it involves dying. But I don't really see him as a weirdo now, even though much of what he believed we would now call mumbo jumbo. I have learned, I think, the first lesson of biography, that we need to take people on their own terms, not on ours. The 19th century was an age of invention, belief, and exploration. People believed they could find answers to almost anything. Roebling more so than most. He was at heart an ideas man. He had thousands over the course of his life. Most missed the mark in one form or another, but some didn't, and those ideas helped change the face of a nation. His views on medicine, for example, may strike us as misguided and delusional, but the medical profession barely entered its infancy by the mid-19th century. To one degree or another, almost all ideas about medicine were wrong. The doctor attending John's brush with cholera blamed the disease on humidity and, quote, soil poison, for example. Instead, John Roebling's life outside of engineering showcased a society struggling to reconcile the rising influence of science with the declining authority of faith and religion. Beliefs were in flux. New knowledge was created at a bewildering pace, much of which refused to sit easily next to established ideas. A surprisingly large number of prominent Americans, judges, journalists, military officers, politicians, businessmen, took to spiritualism, for example, precisely because of this, as John did. And actually, an interesting fact about John is that he came to spiritualism through Charles Colchester, who was the preferred medium for Mary Todd Lincoln. This is an image of Lincoln at a seance. Apparently he went once, never went again. In a climate of change and creation, new things seemed possible and within reach. New ways to build, communicate, and think. New places, materials, and laws to discover, even perhaps talking to the dead. In this, the 19th century was a time of optimism, but also a time of huge loss. War, disease, and large-scale migration separated family members often forever, as it did with Roebling, who lost a beloved child in infancy, had a son fight in the Civil War, and never saw any of his immediate family after leaving Europe when he was 24. This confluence of discovery and loss fed the spiritualist movement, for example, which in turn reflected the age in which it appeared. If the religious impulse represents the search for answers in the face of profound grief, then spiritualism offered comforting, plausible solutions to a bewildering era that took away as much as it promised. Spiritualism sought to bring science into the world of faith, to make the afterlife a verified, observable fact. We might scoff at a nation taken with seances as with hard science, but it's entirely possible that during Roebling's life, more people believed in spirits than in suspension bridges. Roebling, of course, believed in both. This is the most famous image of Roebling. Roebling was a seeker. Roebling was a seeker, a believer, and a scientist. He belonged to the blurred line that ran straight through the 19th century, shaping its unsteady but inexorable march. Roebling helps us remember that the achievements of industry and engineering, what we take to be the triumphs of applied reason, are often created by people with a decidedly different perspective on the world than our own. He is also a reminder that people can be many things, and that contradictions aren't always as clear as with hindsight. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, literature's most rational brain, was a doctor, ophthalmologist, and botanist who studied at one of the UK's most prestigious medical schools. He was a full-throated advocate of vaccinations. He also believed in fairies. Roebling's achievements in applied science stand in somewhat stark contrast to his ideas about other branches of the natural arts, but his failings in this regard weren't his alone. They belonged to the times, just as his successes do. One might also say that they weren't even failings at all. We think of people like John Roebling as embodying great contradictions, but they are only contradictions to us. They weren't contradictions to him or to others of his era. Instead, they were the creaks and groans of a culture working things out, moving itself forward in time and in understanding, trying its messy best to incorporate new aims and new ideas into an existing order. In this, John Roebling was a near perfect reflection of his time. He was a seeker and a believer and an ideas person. He was the 19th century writ large. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now. There we go. Also, the sun's come upon me, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Richard. That was a fabulous talk and introduction to Roebling. And I just want to say, before I start asking questions, that people should put questions either into the chat or into the Q&A, which is down, I think, at the bottom of your screen. And I just really want to start by recommending this book to everyone. It is an incredible story. Roebling is an amazing person. And Richard really has done an extraordinary job of research, going to dozens of repositories. And as I was saying to him earlier, from a 20th century historian's perspective, reading someone's handwriting in the 19th century is much more difficult than us 20th century historians reading typewritten essays. The other thing that is so extraordinary about this book is how accessible it makes very, very technical information. I never thought that I would enjoy a book about engineering. And Richard really gives us a real sense of the engineering profession and the difficulties that Roebling went through in terms of practicing his craft. And so it is a remarkable story in that way. but also, as he has just laid out at the end of his talk, it gives a wonderful sense of the 19th century and the contradictions that made up the whole of Roebling's life and personality and nature. So it really, I cannot recommend it more highly to those of you who have not read it yet. And I guess I just wanted to start off by asking Richard, and I'll get to the questions in just a second. But you write that suspension bridges changed the way people thought about the world and how they moved about in it. And you talked about some of this in your talk, but I wonder if you could expand on that, especially in terms of changing the way that people thought about the world.
Well, I think suspension, the larger point, I suppose, is what used to be called internal improvements. And so Americans sort of, and specifically in a sort of US context, Americans sort of arrive on this continent and sort of start to spread across it. And what they really need is ways to exploit all its resources. And it's the same in Europe. It's one of the great failings of the Soviet Union was it would make all this grain, but it can never get it anywhere. It can never sort of move it around. And so suspension bridges are really an incredibly effective and cheap way to get across large rivers. And what really wants, what sort of capitalism wants, and what the expansion of the economy into globalization really wants in the 19th century is a cheap and easy and efficient way to move things around. Not just people, but also goods and things like that. So suspension bridges are really key for getting goods around the US, for getting cheaply over rivers, and creating that sort of infrastructure of transportation. There's a really interesting history of, again, what used to be called internal improvements in the US in the 19th century, building canals, railroads, to sort of knit the country together and to transport things around the country. And they were sort of interesting because they come against state rights issues and things like that. But they're sort of, suspension bridges are a sort of large measure part of that conversation. You can only start to have these conversations when you have the technology to move things around. It's the same as there's a really long history of linking Brooklyn and New York in the 19th century. It goes on for about 60 years, but no one can actually build anything that can do it. And so it's only really when Roebling comes along that you have the ability to start talking about bridging Manhattan with. I mean, Manhattan is such an important part of the 19th century, but it's an island. And it really needs to expand and have access to the area around it. And so without, I mean, can we imagine modern New York without suspension bridges? And really the sort of, New York gets to about as full and as successful as it can. It needs to sort of link itself around. And so suspension bridges are hugely important to the history of New York. Once the Brooklyn Bridge is raised and opened, politicians start to talk about the consolidation of the 5 boroughs. How soon, now that they are linked physically, how soon will it be before they're linked politically, and to create this sort of powerhouse of New York City. But yeah, suspension bridges are they're just a huge part of transportation history. When you can get over these rivers, and you see it nowadays. I mean, the sort of suspension bridges that are being built in Asia, and that one that between Italy and Sardinia, is it, or somewhere like that, between Scandinavian countries. You can now build suspension bridges that are hugely long. They don't have any piers in the river, or very few piers in the river to obstruct traffic, and they're one of the most effective ways to link large masses over large bodies of water.
Terrific, thank you. We have a number of questions, and let me try to get to as many of them as I can. First question: did Roebling cross paths with the Transcendentalists?
He did not so much cross paths with them, but he was a big reader of Emerson, and he read a lot of Emerson. He read I'm trying to remember the guy. He was friends with a number of the Ohio Hegelians. I don't know if anyone's ever come across that strange group of people, who some of whom corresponded with the Transcendentalists, but they did. So Roebling was someone who read quite deeply in philosophy, and certainly that. And he read a lot of Swedenborg, which also Emerson wrote a lot about Swedenborg as well. So he didn't have any direct. He never met them. He met a number of important philosophers in Ohio, not necessarily that were transcendentalists, but they were sort of part of the sort of Midwest philosophical tradition, and sort of specifically the sort of Midwest Hegelian philosophical tradition. And he read quite widely in Emerson, but he did not, and he was aware of them. I didn't find any examples of them meeting or having lunch.
Thank you. So next question, you talked about his agonizing demise, and there's a question, could you say a bit more about his demise? You go into great detail in the book of his suffering. We don't have to disturb people, but could you say a bit more?
His suffering was, in fact, great. He was so in July 1869, or end of June 1869. He was conducting surveys on the Brooklyn waterfront, and trying to sort of plot where exactly the bridge would run from. And so he was out on the waterfront conducting surveys, and there was a ferry terminal there, and he was perched on the ferry. And actually, I think his son and another chief engineer were coming on the ferry to see him and to meet up with him, because they'd been taking surveys in Manhattan. And he was on the ferry terminal waiting for them to come in, and he stepped back. There's sort of various, if you think about how a boat comes in, there's sort of a floating wooden barrier that helps cushion the impact of the boat when it comes in. Roebling stepped back, would have been standing on that and stepped back from that, but it sort of went over where it was supposed to go and sort of trapped his foot. And so the agonizing part, his son described it as if he'd had his toes cut off by a big set of shears. And so he had his foot mangled, and he lost a number of toes. And he went back to, he was staying in Brooklyn Heights, and he went back to there. And this is a sort of conundrum I don't know we know the answer to, but at some point he contracted tetanus. Now, did he get it from the accident in the ferry terminal? Did he get it from being seen by a doctor in Brooklyn Heights? This is 1869, so it's about almost 20 years before the germ theory of disease is fully understood. And so it could have happened at the site. It could have happened on the way back to Brooklyn Heights, and it could have happened by a doctor. So a doctor attended to him in Brooklyn Heights and cut off the toes that were sort of held on by just skin. But he could have contacted tetanus from there also. And so where it actually comes from is a sort of a bit of a question. But he slowly gets tetanus. And I think if people don't know about it, there's not really a lot of cure for it. And certainly there's no cure for it in the 19th century. So once he's got it, it's sort of curtains for him, really. But he slowly starts to, all your muscles and bones start to seize up. And you sort of get drawn into each other, and your muscles, your lungs stop working. And there's images of him sort of sweating convulsively as his sort of body is drawn into this sort of almost like a rigor mortis, but you're alive. And it takes about a month and a half for him to finally pass away, but he slowly becomes effectively sort of petrified over that period, as happens to people with tetanus. And it's really agonizing. There's actually, one of the great things I was really happy about is I found the diary of one of his assistant engineers, William Payne, right before I finished the manuscript. And I had no idea that anyone had done this, but he actually went to Roebling's house every day and saw to him. So there is actually a diary of descriptions of Roebling sort of dying every day, which is really good to actually have a sense of what the scene was like inside the house as he was slowly succumbing to this disease, and the sort of descriptions of it. And it is an interesting moment in the history of this, because Roebling is the only person who can, or certainly understood to be the only person who can build this bridge. No one would trust this project to anyone else. The Brooklyn Bridge is not, when it's built, its towers are the tallest thing in North America. The roadway is 1.5 times as long as any other bridge. It's a massive leap forward in the history of technology. Roebling's the only person who can build it. As it turns out, his son could build it too. But the press at the time, so they're following these problems in the press, like what's happening with Roebling, because the cities have poured all this money into this project, and without him, it seems like it might be a non-starter. And there's a lot of sort of real civic worry about what's going to happen, as if with Roebling down, the bridge is not going to be able to get built, and the city sort of pinned a lot of its hopes on it. And so it's in the news every day, and there's all sorts of people putting out sort of false information. Oh, he's fine. He'll be back at work tomorrow, and other things like that. And meanwhile, he's slowly ossifying into a sort of demonic statue, unable to breathe or move.
So that is a good segue to the next question, which says, when Washington Roebling was paralyzed by the bends, his wife took a major role in completing the bridge. It seems the marriage was a true partnership. What was John's relationship with his wife? Actually, his two wives is probably a better way of putting it.
That is a really interesting question. It's a really hard question to answer. He married very soon after coming to the US, and with a fellow German immigrant that lived in Saxonburg, and they had many children. The son thinks that the relationship between the father and the mother was abusive, and that Roebling treated her like effectively a sort of piece of chattel. There is very little evidence of this other than that. And as I said, Washington Roebling's memoir is really quite problematic in all sorts of ways. It is demonstrably inaccurate in some regards. It may not be inaccurate in all regards. And certainly the few living items we have, letters and things from Joanna, which is his first wife, none of them are terribly complaining. That might be not entirely surprising. And she seems to have quite a good sense of humor. There's an image of her, a painting of her done. She seems very dour. But it's hard to understand. It's hard to get a real grip on that relationship. There just isn't a lot of evidence, even when you really go looking and digging. The letters we have are not complainy or anything. And one imagines that it was probably a somewhat 19th century sort of upper middle class, maybe upper class relationship. I doubt there was much sense of equality between the sexes or any sense of it. But they certainly had, she wasn't deprived of them. They had servants and a cook and gardeners and all sorts of things like that. And they had, all the sorts of things that you would associate with a sort of middle to upper middle class life thing. The son complains that the father was really, really miserly. But we do know that the family had a lot of stuff. They had, all sorts of modern conveniences in the house. Again, it's hard to quantify the relationship there without much more evidence to make a lot of sort of concrete judgments. The second wife is a bit of a sort of also has a really odd. I should also say about the first wife, when Roebling was doing seances in the late 1860s, he was being fooled because someone was making all those noises, and all the sort of wrappings. But he asked a lot because he kept a record of them, and he asked his ex-wife, his old wife, the wife who had passed away, a lot of questions like, "Were you happy?" So he really you know, was there anything we could have done about your illness towards the end? And so there's a sense that if what he did in those seances, any evidence, what he was concerned that his wife had been happy. He was concerned that they hadn't missed something in her diagnosis when she was ill. I got the death certificate for her. There's no cause of death listed for her, so we don't know what she died of. The second wife is a sort of odd thing too. He married her very, very quickly. There is some evidence that he had known her in Niagara about 15 years before the marriage, but he just turned up with her and said to his kids, like, "I'm married now." And then a couple of years later, his letters to his second wife were also very, very loving. And one imagines, as with the 19th century, there's some sort of marriage of convenience there. Roebling probably thought he needed someone to run his house for him. But again, the letters are quite loving and quite affectionate. But they were only married for a couple of years, and she lived for a further about 20 years after that. I don't know if that answers all your questions, but as with a lot of these situations in the 19th century, there's less evidence than you'd really, really want about relationships between people. And we know, I mean, John Roebling's most important relationship in his life is with his son, Washington. And the frustrating part of that, of course, is that most of that takes place behind closed doors. And so there's a lot of conversations there and a lot of conversations in families that they don't get reported. There's not letters. You don't write letters to the person living in the room next door to you. And so without that, it's hard to, and I'm generally pretty loath to make a lot of assumptions about what people's relationships were without some sort of good evidence. So there's just a lot of, you can do some imagining, but there's also just a lot of like, sort of hope, to be honest as a historian, is to say we don't know enough.
Thank you. So next question is, are you familiar with Susan Buck Morse's dialectic of seeing, which argues that separation between architecture, art, and engineering was not the case in the 19th century? Roebling, as I understand it, included symbolism in his design of the bridge. Your arguments about the social meanings of, I guess, his suspension bridges have helped me appreciate the beauty of the bridge even more.
Well, that's great. That's great news. Yes, I think that, I mean, one of the things that we know about, say, the value, I mean, Roebling used various different architectural styles through his life. And he certainly, if you think about his bridges, they're a lot more ornate. They have a lot more style than contemporary bridges, which really are just trying to solve a sort of mathematical problem, get from one place to another in a sort of way. Some of them can look very elegant, but we tend to think much more functionally about how we design engineering these days. But certainly Roebling thought about what styles and what his notebooks are really interesting in this, because he worked out different designs all the time. So the Niagara Bridge ends up being it's actually a sort of Egyptian revival style, but he played around with all sorts of Romanesque styles, classical styles, Gothic styles, to try and find the right style for the job, so to speak. And what I mean, the Brooklyn Bridge is really his triumph in that regard. And it's sort of the combination of sort of, a lot of people have pointed this out. It's not terribly new for me to say it, but the way that the Gothic inspires that sort of sense of medieval architecture, where engineering and architecture go hand in hand. And so all the architectural elements or the engineering elements in a Gothic cathedral are meant to lift the building upwards. So it takes your view upwards. And so something like a buttress, which is a buttressed wall, which is used in the Brooklyn Bridge, is meant to direct your gaze upwards to the divine. In the Brooklyn Bridge, of course, you have that in combination with steel. So you have this sense of divinity, but also modernity, which is something a lot of painters and other artists and poets have mentioned, how everything in the bridge leads your eye forward. And certainly when you develop a skyline in New York, everything goes up forward to the sort of skyline. So you're looking at New York as a sort of modern technological marvel, like a new divinity in some regards. But these are certainly, I haven't read Buck Moore's book. I'm aware of her, but certainly we have sort of emptied out a lot of symbolism in engineering in the last sort of 100 years, where we're not trying to marry engineering and architecture. They're two separate things rather than two parts of the same whole.
So next question is more of a process one. You can't escape the sun.
I know, I have to just go back here now. I should have worked this out before I came on, shouldn't I?
Tell us more about your process as a researcher and a writer. Did anything come easily? What were the most difficult aspects of this work for you? What did you learn from this research and writing experience?
That's again that's a hard one to get down. It was really a long process. So I've been working on this book since 2005. I wrote another book early on, which was quite a quick book to do, and how do I say this? It's been a really good and really demanding project. People have asked me this about what's your process for doing research. Well, you go everywhere and you look at everything, and then you sort of sort it out. So a large measure of this book is there are two Roebling archives in the US. One is held up at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute at Troy, next to Albany, and that's primarily all the engineering works, because Roebling's kids all went to RPI to do engineering degrees. And the more social and family stuff is in Rutgers University, the Alexander Library at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, and the family settled in New Jersey, so they gave the papers to the State University of New Jersey. So those are really easy. You go there, you look at everything, and you just spend days and days and days going through every box, looking at every single thing. The more strenuous or arduous work is sort of going, and what I did was go to every place where he lived and where he worked and scour the city for any local historical societies, national historical societies, or state historical societies, and just scan through everything they've got. Look at old newspapers. Old newspapers are a really great source, especially for things like bridge building, because usually there's a debate in the newspapers about whether a bridge should be built, and then the process of building that bridge is followed in the newspapers. You can track what is happening, what accidents are happening, what debates are being having, whether financing is being secured, and what is standing in the way, all these other things. So for something like his work in Pittsburgh, I went there and I went to the Carnegie Library and various other libraries, and primarily the Western Pennsylvania Historical Society, which is in the Heinz Center. And you just go through every single thing they have, and you ask about things. I mean, these local education, local historical societies are really brilliant places. They're full of all these local enthusiasts. They have so much local knowledge. There's so many of these places where no one cares about Scranton, apart from people who live in Scranton. But you go there, and there's tons of people who are really happy to talk to you about people who lived in Scranton. Roebling as a sort of Roebling's wire rope business. They did a lot of work with people in sort of Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Pennsylvania in coal country, and a lot of those people lived in Scranton or Würzburg or Monchchunk, I think, which is now called Jim Thorpe, I think. And you go to these places that you were mentioning to me earlier, the Minisink Valley Historical Society. You go to these places and they have all these letters from people, and they're really fascinating. When John Roebling was building all the aqueducts in the Delaware and Hudson, for the Delaware and Hudson Canal, the chief engineer on that canal, his papers are all in the Minisink Valley Historical Society, and they're not. A lot of people aren't really. A lot of national historians aren't interested in these small scale things, but they're really important for building the life of people who lived in those sort of areas. So that stuff, there's a lot of traveling, a lot of going through boxes, a lot of talking to people, a lot of sort of trying to follow leads down. I think
let me cut you off, and just I want to get to two more questions.
Okay.
One question we actually have two questions about the town of Roebling in New Jersey, and people wanted to know, was it a company town?
Yes.
Did John or his sons found it? Can you just talk about that for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to interrupt you with a final question.
Okay. There are great books written about the company town of Roebling. It was a company town. They have a great historical society there. You should go along. And it was built, I think, about 1906, so way after John Roebling died. John Roebling founded John A. Roebling's and Sons Wire Rope Company in Western Pennsylvania in 1842, I think. And in about 1848, they relocated to Trenton, New Jersey, and just expanded exponentially. Much of this happened after John had died. His sons took over, and they made it into a powerhouse company. And one of Trenton's biggest employers for much of the 20th century. And then as they were expanding beyond their confines in Trenton, the sons, it may have even been his grandson at this point, they built the company town of Roebling to expand the thing. But it was nothing to do with John. And I think we're running out of time, so I'll stop it there.
Okay. Last question. Question basically is, what is the greatest takeaway that you would want your readers to walk away with after reading your book?
Oh, God.
A small question.
I know. I've got like 2 minutes to answer this. I think that rather than maybe anything about Roebling, I would like people to have a sense of how fascinating the 19th century was. I am really fascinated by the 19th century. I think it's this book involved a lot of different types of efforts, but really trying to get my head around the 19th century and try and judge it on its own terms, judge the people that lived there and the types of things they were experiencing on their own terms, was really it was a major sort of intellectual part of the book, but also it was I had this sort of feeling at the end of finishing this book, like, I think it's made me a better person. I'm less judgy about other people by understanding where and how and under what circumstances they live. And I've often read books and been like, God, what a fool. But now I'm much less likely to do that because, you really have to put yourself, it's classic cliche, you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes. But I think I learned so much about the 19th century, which I'd read about and thought about before. And I learned a lot about people, about why people think certain ways and why they behave in certain ways. And I think, like I said, I think I started this thinking this is going to be great fun because I'm just going to be able to mock John Roebling all the way through. And I didn't want to mock him. I felt compelled towards him and towards the world he lived in and the struggles he had. And I felt tremendously sympathetic to people who live in a world with much less information and much less knowledge than we have, who are trying to sort of make it up and trying to contribute to that. It's because of John Roebling that we live, and people like him, that we live in the world we live in. I think it's
maybe that's a good way to end
Okay.
with that statement. Thank you, Richard, for a fabulous book, a fabulous talk. It was really wonderful to be able to share this time with you.
Well, thank you. I don't actually thank you for all the participants. I can't see any of you, but thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you all. And note that April 20th, there is another talk that is part of the OAR series. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.